All right, so hey everyone, thank you all for coming. My name is Desmond Cole, and I am the president of the Johns Hopkins Science Policy Group. I am a second-year PhD student here at the School of Medicine. It is my privilege to host Alec Tyson, who is the Associate Director of Science and Society at the Pew Research Center, a nonpartisan fact tank based in Washington, D.C. Alec is an expert in U.S. survey research and has written about American public opinion on a range of topics, including U.S. generations, the growing role of partisanship in American life, climate change, the environment, and trust in scientists. Alec regularly presents findings from the center's studies to various groups in the academic, diplomatic, and policy sectors, and is a frequently quoted expert in national media. Today, Alec will go over several topics pertaining to Pew, including the role of the Pew Research Center, the center's findings on public views of scientists, and a few examples of their work measuring American views on science-related issues like COVID-19 and climate change. For our participants, please feel free to ask questions within the chat feature, or if you're comfortable, you can just unmute or raise your hand, whatever you're comfortable with. For the last 20 or so minutes of the session, I will open the floor to any remaining questions that you might have, so don't be shy. Lastly, I'd like to take a moment to thank Alec for taking the time to meet with all of us. I'm very excited for this discussion and look forward to our presentation today. And with that, let's hear from Alec.
Great. Well, thank you, Desmond, for a nice introduction, and thank you all for having me. I'm really happy to be here, and sort of as Desmond previewed, I'm going to talk for maybe 20, 25 minutes with some slides, but I want to spend at least half our time in a conversation, and maybe some more folks will filter in, but I think we're a relatively small group, so the more conversational I think it can be at the end, I think the better. So feel free just to ask whatever's on your mind, and I'll try my best to answer. So with that, let me make sure I can manage to share my screen here and get everything going. All right, Desmond, will you just confirm that that's full screen and looking good for you?
Yep, looks great.
All right. All right, so I think I've previewed sort of what I want to do. Again, I don't want to spend the whole time presenting, so we'll go to some Q&A. In Desmond's opening, he actually got a lot of this in there, so I can go brief on this. But the Pew Research Center, we call ourselves a fact tank. We try and inform the way that the public thinks about issues, or how stakeholders or policy makers, the information that they have. We try and provide really solid information to those folks, right? And it's really important to note that we are nonpartisan and we are non-advocacy. We don't advocate for any policy or outcome, even on something like climate change. We don't say we should do this on climate. We just sort of bring data to bear to the relevant stakeholders. Our primary funder is the Pew Charitable Trust. There's often a bit of brand confusion, right? The Pew Research Center, the Pew Charitable Trust, and that's kind of natural. They do some programs that are advocacy-based. Some people mix up our work, which is natural. It shares the first name, but the big difference is they might advocate for an outcome, cleaner oceans or something like that. We really are data and information in a nonpartisan, non-advocacy space, right? So that's who we are. And then you see a bit on the bottom, we want to generate this foundation of facts that kind of facilitates public dialogue, support sound decision making. And a lot of what that means is, a lot of what we do is survey research, public opinion research, like how do people feel about the issues that are really shaping their own lives and shaping the world. But that's not all we do. We also do some secondary data analysis stuff with the Census Bureau. We've got some demographers on staff. And then increasingly, we have a project that we call Data Labs, and they basically just try and use computational social science techniques. You can call it big data, you can call it whatever you want. But they lend those skills to answering these same sort of societal focused questions that our opinion polling and our survey research aims to take aim at. Pew Research Center's got a handful of different areas of focus, right? We do a lot of, I guess you could call it our politics shop. They do things about issues like, say, the issue of abortion or immigration, or how you feel about the political parties. We've got some work on religion, on journalism, on the internet. My project is the science and society research, and I just took a little screen grab of our current landing page. And if you look at it, at first it seems like sort of an eclectic mix, right? Like Americans engaging with science news, or home solar panel adoption, some perceptions that health officials were unprepared for COVID-19, and then this report in the middle about how Americans think about US as a leader in science, right? So what connects all of this? You can see some of our conceptual buckets across the top. they're subtle, but this COVID-19, climate, energy, environment, STEM, education, and the workforce. We cover questions that science raises for society. That's our focus. For public opinion, we're never going to be measuring things like hard science. We don't ask the public what they know about chemistry or what they know about physics. We focus on issues that have a scientific grounding, that have scientific implications, right, or societal implications. You kind of see it in the subhead of my slide there. When science raises either ethical or moral questions or policy questions for the country, we think it's important to get the public's voice in the mix, right? It's not to say the public is always right, but we just believe that as a democracy, as a country, these conversations are going to be more robust and healthier if we have reliable data, nonpartisan, non-advocacy data, on how the public feels about a given issue that connects with science, right? So that's kind of the big picture of what we try and do. So I've got 3 short, you can call them big vignettes or segments. They're not exhaustive or comprehensive, but I just wanted to give you a flavor for the type of work we do. So I have some actual substantive findings from different buckets, different areas. And as I said, if you're interested, there's more I can share via links or on our website. I just want to give you a flavor for the type of work that we do. If you kind of understand who we are, the questions we try and tackle, well, what does the work actually look like, right? So that's what I'm going to do here for a few slides. My first topic is trust in science, public trust in science, or trust in scientists, hopefully of interest to this group, right? I'll engage in some form of science. So these are all public opinion questions we ask of US adults. And this question just asks fairly simply, how much confidence do you have each of these groups that you see down the side to act in the best interest of the public, right? Do you have a great deal or a fair amount? Those are the categories we show. And then the data we don't show is those that say not too much or none at all, like sort of a negative assessment, right? So we're just showing the positive here. You've seen I highlighted scientists, 77% have at least a fair amount of trust in scientists. That ranks pretty well against some other prominent groups and institutions in society, right? It's sort of near the top up there with military and head of police officers, better than school principals, better than religious leaders. And then it's not a very good time for elected officials or even journalists, so you can see them ranking towards the bottom. But even that's kind of interesting, you know, to see the relative standing of some of these prominent groups. So the good news is that scientists are held in pretty high regard in a general sense among the public when compared to other prominent groups and institutions. And as I go through, what I'm trying to illustrate is the different ways you can bring polling to bear to add insight, right? And so this is one of the ways you can add insight. This is a trend over time. This same question, but I'm just showing the data for scientists over time. And there's an interesting story here, right? If you look at April of 20, and if you think back to April of 20, this is the very early days of the coronavirus outbreak, right? And there was a little bit of an uptick in confidence in scientists. And if you look at that great deal share, the darker blue, you can actually see that edged up. It's modest, but 4 points to 39%. But what's happened since April of 20 is a little bit of a decline in public confidence in scientists, right? We see that overall share with at least a fair amount down to 77, and the share with the great deal is down to 28, right? So still in a relative sense held in high regard, but there has been a slippage in confidence in scientists since the pandemic. And what we try and do with our work sometimes is understand the why. And one way to understand the why is to look at subgroups, right? I'm talking about looking at views by party or by age or by gender, whatever variable might be of interest to you. So part of the story behind this significant, modest but significant decline in trust in scientists has to do with partisanship, okay? Now what I have on this slide is that same data for scientists. On the left side is views among Republicans and those who lean to the Republican Party. And on the right side, you see that same data for Democrats. And hopefully you can just see, it's pretty apparent, hopefully, if you look at this, you can see that there's really been a pretty sharp drop off in confidence expressed by Republicans, right? About 20 points or so. And among Democrats, much more modest, right? For Democrats, you do see that this intense or strongest level of trust, this great deal, this dark blue, that slipped a little bit, but the overall level of at least a fair amount has held pretty stable. And so what we can think about if we flip through these slides, yes, held in high regard, but there's been a modest downtick over the past few years, and it's been driven particularly by a downtick among Republicans, right? And you could ask yourself, like, why does trust in science matter? And I think it matters in a lot of ways, including, uptake or abidance by public health recommendations. It's correlated with your trust in science. We've seen that in our own research. And I think what data like this helps folks do in the science communication or policy space is understand groups or subgroups that they might need to be putting in a little more effort understanding or connecting with, right? Because clearly something's happening here, bipartisanship, when it comes to views of science and scientists. But I didn't want to leave the topic of science without a little bit of good news. So these are some broad overall questions, right? Starting from left to right, 81% of the public takes the view that government investments in scientific research, you can almost think of this as basic science, right? We're very clear that we're not talking about a specific policy. We're just talking about basic scientific research. 81% of the public think that's a worthwhile investment for society, a pretty robust endorsement. Is it important for the US to be a world leader in scientific achievement? Like 91% of Americans say that's at least somewhat important. Even 54% give it this really strong, very important level. And this third one, I wouldn't say it's necessarily good or bad news, but it's this sense that the US is not gaining ground globally when it comes to scientific achievement, right? And I think you hear that from certain expert, in the field. But only 14% of Americans think the country is gaining ground relative to others in its science achievement. So I'll leave this sort of science bucket there for a bit, but that's like a flavor of what we use public opinion research to do to get these overall impressions of science and scientific leaders. Of course, the coronavirus outbreak has been a topic we've spent a lot of time on over the past 2 years at the center, and we've done a lot, right? So I didn't think I could share all the work we've done here, but I'll give you a few examples before I get into my slides about how polling or our work has mattered in this space. I'm sure many of you have tried to understand or watch sort of vaccine hesitancy, the share of Americans who chose not to get a vaccine, and how that differed across subgroups. And government data is pretty good at a lot of things, but for any of you who have worked with it, you know that many things are missing from government data, including partisan affiliation, religion, sometimes even race and ethnicity, depending on the policies of a given state. These are things that surveys like ours can help fill in the gap. So I don't have a lot of this data here because I just chose to go in another direction. But even some of this basic understanding about how vaccine uptake varies by partisanship or race and ethnicity, or to the extent it doesn't, right now there's very little difference by race and ethnicity. But the differences by religion, like white evangelicals versus white mainline Protestants or non-evangelicals, that's survey research, right? That's survey research like the work we do or other comparable organizations, because that's often data that the government doesn't have because they don't ask about things like partisanship and race and ethnicity. And even government data has its weaknesses. So we're better when we have both good public polling and good government kind of records to kind of align and be sure we're seeing the same patterns. So what I chose to focus on here is, there's been some criticism of the CDC and their response, right? The Rochelle Walensky has essentially acknowledged that and said there's going to be changes to the organization. We tracked over time, how good a job do you think each of these entities is doing responding to the outbreak? And if you look at the top middle, right, you'll see public health officials such as those at the CDC. And you can see that trend went down a bit at the start of the outbreak. Majorities thought they were doing an excellent or good job. And the fall has kind of stabilized, right? It almost has had a modest bounce, but it's really only about half of the public that thinks the CDC is doing an excellent or good job responding to the outbreak. That's down from close to 80% at the start of the outbreak. You can see they're not alone in that you can see a drift downwards for state and local officials and really for the two presidents. I think that just has to do with the ongoing nature of the outbreak, how long it's lasted, toll it's taken, that the public really was getting frustrated with the state of the outbreak. But I want to focus on CDC officials because, again, our survey can help understand the why, or at least get a little more texture, right? So this slide's a little dense. There's a lot of statements on it. But we said, in thinking about public health officials and how they've responded to the outbreak, how well do each of these statements describe your own views, right? And the top statement that resonated with Americans was that they were unprepared for the outbreak. A pretty strong statement, right? And that 46% of Americans say this described their views extremely or very well, like a really strong resonance with them, right? If you were to include the folks who said, oh, it resonated somewhat well, it'd go even higher, like a majority of Americans, right? But there's also nuance here. The second most common response, or that resonates the second most widely with the public, is a sense that elected officials sort of interfered with public health officials, right? That they had some challenges in doing their jobs. And then you'll see some other responses here that resonate a bit less widely, but I want to get into, again, partisanship matters so much in the COVID outbreak, right? And so here are those same responses, but broken out by views among Republicans and views among Democrats. And you can look at it for a minute here. You might see a couple of things, right? I think it's really interesting in a polarized moment that essentially equal shares of Republicans and Democrats feel that the CDC and public health officials were unprepared for the outbreak. That's pretty notable during where there's been such big differences on so many other questions having to do with policy. But then you see views sort of start to diverge. For Republicans, are much more inclined to say the personal views of public health officials had too much influence on policy. And they're also more inclined to say that public health officials were too quick to dismiss other competing views, right? Views that challenge their scientific understanding. On the flip side, Democrats really present a different set of opinions. They express this sentiment that public health officials didn't get enough credit for the job that they did. And they strongly resonate with this idea that interference from elected officials hurt public health officials' ability to do their job, right? So that's maybe a little briefer. I probably should have brought more slides on coronavirus because we've really done a lot, but hopefully that gives you a flavor of some of the things we did. And I would go back to the first thing I said, that even on this essential question of intent to get a vaccine and vaccine uptake, that's where polling can serve a pretty important role, I think, in a public health sense. So the last little vignette or section that I have before getting to our sort of Q&A is views of climate change, right? Science is so connected to climate science or understanding or predictions about the future of climate change. And so we do spend a fair amount of time on this topic. First place I want to start is with this idea of salience, or how important is this issue to people, right? So I went back to 2020 because I sort of like this slide. We ask registered voters each election, how important is each issue to your vote? Things like the economy or crime or healthcare. And you can see that among all registered voters, climate change ranks pretty low. 42% say it's very important to their vote, and you can sort of see impressionistically these other issues. It's at or near the bottom in terms of salience or importance for voters. But if you just stop there, you'd sort of be missing an important part of the story. And that is, for Biden supporters, folks who are overwhelmingly Democrats, it's an upper tier issue. Now, I will say it's not the top issue. You can see at least 4 dots above that, right? So I think it's important to say that for Democrats, absolutely climate is an important issue. In our work, in others, it's rarely, if ever, the most important issue. And I think that's an important distinction, right? Is that it really matters a lot for Democrats, but it's still not at the top of their issue list. And if you look at views among Trump supporters, primarily Republicans here, what a different picture you see, right? It was dead last out of the 12 issues we tested in 2020. And all these data are appropriately plotted. It was last by kind of a mile, right? Look at the gap between the 11% and the next dot, right? It was by far the lowest salience issue in 2020. So that's important to understand, these different partisan differences in terms of how important the issue of climate change is. But I think we need to go beyond that, right? This is where I think our work plays an important role. So if you just saw this slide, you could come up with all sorts of assumptions, including that, well, Republicans or Trump supporters, they'd never back any climate policies, right? Look how low salience of an issue it is. But that's actually not the case. And that's another thing that polling is good at, is sort of nuance, right? And you see I put it in gray in the slide title here. But policy support isn't always the same as salience. You can support a policy or a set of actions, even on an issue that isn't the most important issue to you personally or the most important issue to your vote. And that's part of what you see here. So these are proposals to reduce the effects of climate change. 90% of Americans support this idea of planting about 1 trillion trees to absorb carbon emissions, including 88% of Republicans and 92% of Democrats. Real partisan agreement on this one, right? A bit of a gap when you get to some other ones, but still majorities of both Republicans and Democrats say they back tax credits to businesses that develop carbon capture and storage. And these gaps do widen as you go down, but even on tougher restrictions on power plant carbon emissions, a fairly aggressive policy, right? 58% of Republicans say they would favor that. And so here's where we can see some nuance between the dimension of issue salience and policy support. We can see how the proposals matter, and we've done even more work on this. And basically, one of the things that is the most important to Republicans when it comes to climate policy is economic impacts, potential cost increases and things like that. And you can think about that frame when you look at this slide. Not that planting 1 trillion trees would be costless, but from a business or economic perspective, there doesn't seem, it's less onerous than say a tax on a corporation where you see some of the support go lower. So just an example of how we can go even further than this and get even more texture with surveys.
It looks like we have a question in the.
Sure. Yeah, let's do it now. Yeah, we can do them as they come in. That's fine.
I saw a hand raise. I don't see it anymore.
Yeah. Well, how about this? If I'm going to wrap up probably in 2 or 3 minutes, and then we can go back to the slide if we need to, or we can just handle it then. And who knows? Maybe it was a misclick of a button. I know that sometimes.
Yeah.
sometimes
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. With this one I included, climate policy is so connected to energy, right? The idea of becoming carbon neutral by 2050. Most Americans favor this idea. 69% of Americans say they favor the US taking steps to become carbon neutral by 2050. I think that's just an interesting question. It's sort of really big picture, right? It's a fairly blunt question. We don't say exactly how or what the trade-offs would be, but it's still important to get those underlying, you can call it a gut check or overall sentiment, like, is this a good idea or a bad idea? And I think that's what we show here. You see a difference by party, but what I included this slide for is to show that parties are really diverse, broad coalitions, and there are differences within parties, either by political ideology or different characteristics like education. And here you can see that moderate Republicans are really in favor of this idea of taking steps to become carbon neutral. And conservative Republicans stand out for holding the opposite view, that they're against this idea. But if you were to paint Republicans with a broad brush, you'd miss some of this nuance, that there are important differences within the coalition when it comes to this idea of moving towards carbon neutral. There are areas where Democrats are similarly divided. Climate and energy typically isn't one of them. You can see pretty large majorities of both moderate and liberal Democrats favor taking steps to become carbon neutral. A lot of ink on this slide, but it's an important question, right? How much is human activity contributing to climate change? A great deal, some, not too much, or not at all. And the reason I included this slide is it gets in part to some of the why for Republicans. You can see the share of Republicans who think humans are contributing a great deal to climate change is 22%. You've got some in this sort of soft sum category, 43%, but a third say not too much and not at all. And so I think that connects to where we started. It's a lower salience issue. And while they do support some policy approaches, there are others that they're cooler on, but that connects to this idea, if you don't believe humans are playing a major role in warming the earth, it would follow from there that you would see it as, taking action is a very important priority. So this again is getting to some of the why, or trying to understand the drivers of some of the overall opinion that we see. But maybe on a different note, I'd say that a colleague of mine said this the other day, and I thought it was actually quite well said. He said, supporting, I'm going to paraphrase and do it badly, but supporting climate change doesn't have to have anything to do with climate change. And what he meant by that was, there's majority support for things like clean air and clean water, right? If you live near a coal plant, you have particulate matter in the air, you might have sort of runoff in the mines to water. So his point was making, it's almost connected to the difference between salience and policy. There's a lot of reasons for supporting different policy actions, and not every one of them has to be directly tied to climate change. So I thought that was an interesting point. I don't know, I just kind of share that ad hoc here. Okay, so I think that's going to end it for my slides. I am on Twitter. We've got a pretty good presence on Twitter, the center. So if you're interested in these sort of public opinion, data and information type findings, you can follow us there. You can find us there. But with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I just look forward to having a conversation with all of you.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. So yeah, looks like we do have a question.
Oh yeah, can I ask?
Of course.
It was pretty interesting to like go around those stats, and I have a question about them. So, do you think that when we write policy statements as STEM students, like should we look at the stats to know that, like, to predict that we will have more supporters for a policy rather than like more than another, or should we just look at the scientific research of like human effects on climate change? So should
Yeah.
we like look at the supporters and opposing situation, or stats, or the STEM research
Yeah.
on that subject?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's actually a really complicated one, isn't it? I guess what I would say is I'm just one voice in that calculation, and I think there are folks within your training programs who would have a lot of insight on that as well. But what I would say is you absolutely should be aware of or consider the opinion angle. It's similar to what I said at the start, is that the public's not always right and the public shouldn't always dictate. But you would be poorly served if you were unaware of the underlying public opinion dynamics when writing. I'm not overly familiar with the types of proposals you all write, but I think incorporating that into your thinking is important. I would probably suggest against a sort of one-to-one adherence. I'm gonna direct my idea to where the public is and not where it isn't, because again, the public's not always right. Opinions can change. That's something we always say, is opinion is a snapshot. You know what I mean? Events in the world, elected officials, political parties, even scientific studies and findings can shift and shape opinion. So I wouldn't be overly adherent to where the public is, but I think you would be well served to take some time to understand opinion on an issue that's particularly important to you if you're writing a paper that, again, I'm not familiar with your particular proposals, but I think it would make it a better proposal, either to see it as an opportunity to inform or change or shift or work against a tide that you think is running counter to scientific understanding, or to leverage the support already in the public for something that you think could hold great promise, right?
Awesome. It looks like we have a couple of questions that popped up in the chat too. The first one is from Nate. It says, while the trust of scientists is solid, I'm worried about a growing distrust in the future. What can we do as young, up-and-coming scientists to convince or increase trust in older populations for scientific discovery and data?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And here's almost where I just got to be clear that these are my own views. It's not in the data, you know, I'm just kind of representing myself. But I almost think back to the COVID-19 vaccine efforts, where trusted messengers within a community are so powerful. So if you can identify some subgroups of the population, maybe with more conservative views, maybe with other characteristics, it's so important to have someone from that community who can speak with that community about the benefits of science and the work that scientists does. Maybe too often folks assume that talking in their own sophisticated language, scientific terms, is going to be apparently attractive to all types of folks, and that's just not how the world works, right? We connect with folks who can appreciate or understand our backgrounds or where we're coming from. So kind of meeting people where they are with a sort of humility, I think, is powerful across all issue areas. And then what I'd say in addition to that is we do know that this idea of transparency resonates with the public. Maybe the idea of peer review isn't so well understood, but some of the basic tenets of open data, transparency, these are things that the public understands, that these are cues of being reliable or good data. It doesn't mean they're always going to agree with you or always think it's great, but some of these best practices and transparency, open data, things like that, the public does see them as cues that this may be a more credible body of research than another.
Awesome. It looks like we have a couple raised hands too. Is it Lila?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks for your talk. It's super interesting. I'm curious, you I guess emphasized in the beginning how this research is conducted in the context of a nonpartisan and also non-advocacy based organization. I'm curious how then the kind of questions you decide to ask and the kind of research you decide to do, how that comes to be, and what are kind of the guiding missions or goals of the research.
Yeah, no, that's a good observation. The great benefit of the organization or perk of the organization is those decisions by and large are made within the research center, which is really appealing to researchers to have that type of autonomy. But we are wedded to our mission statement that these have to be societally relevant questions, right? We can't depart too much from things that are at the center of public life and public debate. I mean, we have a board of directors, and we have sort of an internal process where we propose ideas. The directors kind of discuss them as a group and sort of say this one looks more promising than that one. Then ultimately, our leadership team of president and vice presidents sign off on the final portfolio, and they're basically responsible for saying that it aligns with our mission to provide, information in the public interest that's on relevant issues that's interesting for engaged Americans as well as policymakers. And that represents some type of ideological balance, right? That you can do nonpartisan research, but you could choose only issues of interest to liberals. You could do nonpartisan research and choose issues only of interest to conservatives, right? So we really think about the suite or basket of our research. But personally, part of the reason I like working here so much, and I think many of my colleagues feel the same way, is it's a great responsibility, but it's also a great thing to have so much freedom in what you study. If you want to make a pitch for a topic and it aligns with our values and in our mission statement, and the directors sign off on it, we have a fair amount of autonomy to select the topics in our work. Going a little further, when it gets down to how do you write a fair question or a balanced question, diversity across all aspects, race and ethnicity, gender, of course, but also background, rural, urban, suburban, even disciplines, sociology, political science, psychology. We benefit from diversity in all of its facets because it's such a subjective thing to say this is interesting or this is a good question or this is biased or this isn't. So that's really part of our ethos as well, is considering a question or a topic from all sides of the public debate, right? And it's not for everyone. A lot of folks are passionate about their politics, with a party on an issue. And honestly, sometimes we just have to say to those folks, we're not sure if this is the best place for you to work because your passion seems to be in advocacy or for an outcome or for a person or a group. And that's just a line that we can't cross.
All right, and is it Eva?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks again for the presentation. I think following up on Lila's question, in terms of your internal processes in developing these surveys and then representing the data, I guess there are a lot of decisions that get made, and I imagine your work has evolved over time. Like, you probably have developed different ways of doing data visualizations, and you've changed the way you do surveys gradually. Where does the feedback come from in terms of like, how can you improve that process internally? Like, how do you know if you're doing something well?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of, I could probably talk on 10 minutes on that one because there's a lot to do with it. Part of it is we do pay attention to our impact, right? Our funder wouldn't fund us if we weren't having impact. One way to think about impact is how much does the news media cover your work? And so that's one indicator. Are we doing things that are interesting or relevant? Are we covered by major national media? Because they see value in our work, right? But that's not the only measure of impact. You can talk about stakeholders, right? We're often asked to brief members of Congress or state level policymakers or experts in certain domains. And so that's another measure of impact. The folks, we have a small group, but a group that thinks about these measures is a very difficult thing because it all depends on how you define success, right? You could look at clicks on your website. And what we try and do is to identify sort of a basket of metrics: news clips, sort of a lead or stakeholder engagement, and clicks on the website. Because if you focus on just one, you might not be getting the full picture. You know, you can write clickbait and get more clicks, but are you having impact? Are you getting meaningful coverage? Are you reaching stakeholders? Maybe not. So we think in the balance of some of those metrics, we see whether we're doing well or not. The start of your question was a little bit different. It's basically like, how do you refine the tools or the decisions in your work? Like any field, I think academics, we're not academics. I mean, some of us are trained as academics, not myself, but some are. Academics are very free with their criticism, right? At least in social science, you know, I would have written it this way, I would have done it that way. So we do listen to that, it is valuable. And we also have a pretty robust internal culture of deliberation, not one that's negative in tone, but we have a lot of smart colleagues. And if they see something, they're like, Alec, why'd you do it that way? You know, we have a healthy pressure internally. And then you mentioned data visualization or graphics. I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent, but if you do see our work on our website or on social media, we really try to work on the visuals, the charts and tables, because we think that's such a powerful tool for communication, especially when we're trying to reach the general public. We're not trying to reach exclusively academics or elites or well-educated folks. We want someone with a high school degree who's interested in an issue to be able to pull up our website and get something out of something we wrote. And part of that is good data visualization. We spend a lot of time on it. Sometimes, like most of the reports that I write, we start with the charts and tables. We'll spend like 4 or 5 days deciding what the key findings are, how to present them, and getting the charts right, and then we'll write around them, you know, instead of going the opposite way.
Awesome. It looks like there's a question too in the chat that we don't want to miss. This from Yezi. Yezi says, it's fascinating to learn about these poll results. Thank you. I'm wondering how these polls are conducted. Is Pew mostly using random digital data, river sampling, other ways, mixed? And how much does this usually cost?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it looks like we've got someone who knows something about survey methods, which is certainly interesting. If you know anything about public opinion, the mode in which you collect data has changed over time. You know, in the 50s, it was face-to-face. It would be address-based, and it was random sampling, but it's based on an address list, and folks would literally knock on the door and conduct an interview with pen and paper, right? Or pencil and paper, whatever. Then there was sort of a golden era of telephone polling. Again, it's this principle of random selection. You could do random digit dials where everyone had a known or roughly equal share of being called, and you would random dial, and people had landlines and had really great coverage. And that was actually, there's like a golden era of landline phone polling where the methodology was rock solid, right? But then cell phones and another of trends have sort of disrupted that. For a while, or up until recently, we incorporated cell phones into the dialing plan, right? And that was how we adjusted. But within the past 5 years or so, I mean, you can still do good polling on the phone if you incorporate cell phones, but it's extraordinarily expensive because so many people don't pick up. I mean, imagine your own life. I mean, how many unknown numbers are you just picking up and having a 20-minute call with? You know, some people do, but it makes it expensive to get those hit rates. So what we've done, and others have also done this, although there's a variety of methods in the field, is we recruited a nationally representative online panel. So we used address-based sampling and years ago some telephone polling to recruit a nationally representative random sample of folks, and then we onboarded them onto this panel where we basically have them answer surveys online. And if they don't have internet access, because we wouldn't want to exclude the relatively small but really important to cover group of folks that don't have internet access, we provide them with a prepaid sort of tablet to take surveys on. So we think that's a pretty robust design, and we're really confident in it. But we're certainly aware that people have questions about polling and the accuracy. Every election, you hear people talking about polling and the accuracy of polling. I'd say 2 things on that without being completely off on another separate talk, because I could talk for an hour about polling estimates. Is the polling that I've shared with you today is estimates of all U.S. adults. It's a known population, and that's what most issue polling tries to cover, all U.S. adults. Election polling is trying to capture an unknown universe. It's the share of adults, the share of registered eligible voters who might show up on election day, right? and 40 to 35% of eligible voters don't show up on election day in presidential elections. Even more don't show up on midterm elections. So that variable of uncertainty, trying to predict the population that you're trying to cover for, is part of why election polling is so much more difficult than issue polling that I'm sharing with you today, because we know our known universe of all US adults. We don't have to try and predict what share of US adults we're trying to issue an estimate for. And the other thing I'd say, in an election polling, it really matters if you're off by 2 points or 3 points. If you think the outcome is going to be 52 to 48 and it turns out to be 50-50, that's a fairly consequential difference. Where in issue polling, you can think about anything that I just shared with you today. Say 69% of Americans favor taking steps to become basically carbon neutral by 2050. And you can ask yourself, if that estimate, and they are survey estimates, was 2 points different, would the story change? And in most cases, I would suggest that it wouldn't, right? Whether it's 67% or 71% or 69%, you have a majority of the public in favor of a policy. So that's a little bit about methods and a little bit about how I see the distinction between the work we do and a prediction, and some context for how you should best understand polls. They're survey estimates. You should always consider them. They have a margin of error within 2 or 3 points, and ask yourself, if the story would fundamentally change in those 2 points, well, I should consider that. But in most cases, it wouldn't. So, you know, that's my answer for that question.
Awesome. Looks like we have more raised hands. So we have Sawar.
Oh yeah, okay. So I want to ask about how to raise awareness about such global problems. Like, as an academic and a researcher in such fields in science and policy, what do you think, or how did you recognize the best way to raise awareness about such projects like climate change or nuclear energy or healthcare? Or so what is the most convenient way that did raise awareness about such problems, or that had the most outreach in public?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I certainly understand the question. It goes a little bit beyond my expertise, and it's connected to this idea that we don't take policy positions or advocate for outcomes. So we're not really involved in efforts to change Americans' minds or make an issue more visible. But I think I can offer at least one nugget that might be useful, is at least in the climate issue area, there's been this idea that if people understood more about climate science, or if they were better educated, they would feel differently, right? Like if you knew more, you'd be more supportive of efforts to deal with climate change. That's really not what we find within particularly the Republican Party. The best educated Republicans are as or more cool towards efforts to deal with climate change. So this idea that if people knew more about science, of course they would support certain policies, we see very mixed or no evidence for that in certain areas. So that's one thing I think you can think about. And I'll offer you a little bit of the thinking of, well, why might that be, right? The best educated folks are often the most attuned to partisanship. Like, the most engaged Republicans are higher educated folks, right? And some of the elite messaging or the party line on those issues, those better educated folks are much more likely to be aware of it or align with it, right? So you have these, they might understand scientific findings better, but they're also very attuned to the leadership and the messaging out of their party. And this partisan identity on an issue like climate change seems to matter more than any variable like education or awareness or scientific understanding. So that could vary issue to issue, and there's a lot of nuance there. But in general, I would share that finding with folks from this group, that it's not so simple as if people knew more, they would think differently. There's a lot of intervening variables like partisan identity and other considerations that come into that mix.
Thank you so much.
All right, and Eva?
Thanks. I guess I have another research methods question. In your work, do you usually put together survey, or exclusively put together survey questions that are like easy to answer in sort of a multiple choice setting, so then it's easy to quantify? Or do you ever find yourself needing to use more other like qualitative methods that like most of my work is like STEM research, so I'm not really familiar with those methods, and it's sort of a whole separate world of research that, and yeah, I'm just curious how you guys use those tools.
It's a timely question because of what I'll share in a minute here. The majority of our work is these closed-ended survey questions. You know, do you favor this? Do you oppose it? Do you think this is a good idea or a bad idea? How much have you heard about this? You know, fairly simple structures. We try and write our questions at about a 10th grade reading level for a lot of reasons, right? People are busy, they're skimming, they're scanning. You want your questions to be clear and accessible. And sometimes we'll get criticism from, say, folks near your orbit who are really the best experts, and they want to use a lot of technical language and write a paragraph. And that's not a good survey question, right? People lose comprehension, they lose attention, and you get worse data quality with long, highly technical language, even if it's the most precise description of the issue. Folks can't follow it. So we, for the most part, work in closed-ended quantitative questions that are fairly direct and accessible, and that people have a reasonable basis for responding to. You don't want to do something where you almost feel like you're creating opinion by asking a question someone's never heard of, and they'll give you an answer to be agreeable, but is that real opinion? You know, so we have to be careful about that line. But the majority of what we do is as I just described it, increasingly we've been using some qualitative focus groups to build out our understanding of an issue or a subgroup. One way we've used it recently is to better understand or speak to issues faced by Asian Americans. There's so much diversity of language among Asian Americans that it's incredibly difficult to do a quantitative survey because you'd need to translate it into so many multiple languages. That's one among many factors. Another, some of the nations of origin can be fairly small, and your sample size comes into play there from these traditional quantitative methods. But that's where these qualitative techniques like focus groups can really help bring to bear the experiences and views of these groups that you might be limited from this traditional survey approach, either by language translation issues or just the incidence in the population that these traditional quantitative methods don't have the sample size to analyze necessarily all subgroups. So it is something I've seen more of in, say, past 5 years at the center than I did the first 10 or 15 for some of the reasons I described.
All right, and Lila?
I'm curious to hear more about something you mentioned in response to one of the earlier questions. You said that one of the ways you kind of judge the success of a particular project is by looking at impact and uptake by stakeholders. I'm curious what kind of, I guess, feedback or input you seek out from potential stakeholders when you're kind of in the earlier stage of a project. Do you kind of figure out what stakeholders may potentially exist for a particular area of research and kind of poll what kind of things they might be interested in learning about? Like, I'm curious what kind of, I guess, external input you receive in kind of the earlier stages of a project.
Yeah, honestly, it's something we have to be a little bit cautious about. There's a lot of insight we can gain from talking to those groups, but there's also a risk that they would sort of steer us in a direction that's specific to their interests, right? And this gets to this non-advocacy stance. So I think where we're most successful is starting almost a step back in saying, is this an active debate in the country when we're picking topics? You really can pick anything, but immigration, you know, there's a lot of demand to understand how Americans feel on immigration. There's a lot of policy folks or advocacy organizations who are stakeholders and want to make informed decisions. But starting with the stakeholders there can be a little fraught because oftentimes they hold fairly strong views about what the outcome should be or what policies are supported. So I would say most of our conversations with stakeholders come after the research project is produced, and we're very willing to share with folks from all sides of the aisle our findings, and they can think about how those would inform their work. But we're a little reluctant to get too close to stakeholders at the outset because it may set an expectation that we'll pursue their ideas, or could even, it's a really fine line between a nice brainstorm session and sort of filling your brain with thoughts from one perspective or another, right? So I think we tend to focus more on the stakeholder relationships when we're sharing our work rather than when we're designing it, though there can be some thoughtful exceptions to that for special projects and things like that.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions? All right. Well, thank you so much again, Alec, for coming. This was such a pleasure hosting you and just sharing so much incredible information. I'm assuming if people have any other questions, they could contact you outside of the meeting.
Yeah, sure. The Twitter is a good way to find me. I try and check if I have any mentions here and there, and I don't tweet every day, but when we have new reports, I try and put them out there. So yeah, I love to stay in touch with all y'all. Happy to be here.
All right, awesome. Oh, Lana's
Reshare
asking
your
if you can
Twitter. Yeah,
reshare.
let me see. Hold on, let me see if I can do this. Let me type into the chat. There's some underscores in it. So I think I'm getting this right. Yeah, we'll see. Twitter's got some stuff going on, but for now, that's where I'm at. So it's at Alec_H_Tyson. And another good one, if you have any, you can just Google me and it'll come up. But another good one is at Pew Research, which I'll type it in now, which has sort of the broadest selection of our work at the center, and they feature the stuff by science, and you'll find us through them too.
Awesome. All right, thanks again. You guys have a great evening.